This is about showing people that hard work and proper technique matter more than size or appearance. The competition organizer, a local businessman who volunteered for various festival events, looked surprised when Sarah signed up. "Are you sure about this, honey? This competition usually draws some pretty strong guys." "I'm sure," Sarah replied calmly, writing her name on the registration form in clear, confident letters. Marcus was already on the platform, warming up with exaggerated stretches and flexes designed to show off his muscular arms. He had removed his jacket, revealing the broad shoulders and defined biceps that had made him the star of the football team. Several of his friends were cheering and making comments about how quickly the competition would be over. The format was simple: single elimination bracket with each match continuing until one person's hand was pinned to the table. Participants were matched randomly for the first round, with winners advancing until only one remained. Sarah was relieved to see that she and Marcus were placed in different brackets, meaning they couldn't face each other until the finals, assuming they both made it that far. Sarah's first opponent was Jake Morrison, a senior from her school who worked part-time at a local warehouse. Jake was bigger than Sarah, but not particularly athletic, and he approached the match with obvious confidence. He settled into position across from her at the table, his larger hand easily engulfing hers when they locked grips. "Sorry about this, Sarah," Jake said with what he probably thought was a charming smile. "I'll try to make it quick so it doesn't hurt too much." The referee, a retired gym teacher who had volunteered to officiate, positioned their arms properly and gave them a moment to set their grips. Sarah took the time to study Jake's positioning, noticing that he was relying entirely on the size advantage of his arm and shoulder muscles. "Ready?" the referee asked. Both competitors nodded. "Go!" Jake immediately attempted to slam Sarah's hand down with pure force, putting all of his strength into a quick, decisive victory. For a moment, it seemed like his strategy might work. Sarah's smaller hand bent backward under the initial assault, and several spectators made sympathetic noises. But Sarah had been expecting exactly this approach. Instead of trying to match Jake's raw power directly, she used her superior technique and grip strength to absorb his initial attack, and then gradually turn the momentum in her favor. Her grandfather had taught her that arm wrestling, like most physical competitions, was as much about leverage and technique as it was about pure strength. Slowly, steadily, Sarah began to push back. Jake's confident expression changed to surprise, then concern, as he realized that his quick victory wasn't materializing. Sarah's hand, which had seemed on the verge of being pinned just seconds earlier, was now moving back toward the center position. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, putting more effort into his grip, but Sarah's advantage was only growing. Her fingers, strengthened by years of gripping tools and engine parts, maintained their hold even as Jake tried desperately to break her technique. Her wrist, developed through countless hours of applying torque to stubborn bolts, remained solid and stable even under significant pressure. The crowd's murmur grew louder as Sarah continued to gain ground. Jake was now straining visibly, his face red with effort, while Sarah appeared calm and controlled. She wasn't rushing or forcing the movement, just applying steady, relentless pressure that Jake couldn't seem to counter. With a final surge of power, Sarah pinned Jake's hand to the table. The referee raised her arm in victory, and the crowd erupted in surprised applause. Jake sat back in his chair, staring at his hand in disbelief. "Good match," Sarah said, offering Jake her hand for a sportsmanlike shake. He took it automatically, still too stunned to fully process what had just happened. Sarah's victory over Jake sent ripples of excitement through the crowd. The small girl who worked on cars with her grandfather had just defeated a much larger opponent in a contest of pure strength. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see how far she could advance in the competition. Marcus had been watching from across the platform, and Sarah could see the concern growing in his expression. His own first-round match had been a quick, easy victory over a middle-aged man who had entered more for fun than from any real expectation of success. But Sarah's technical display against Jake had clearly been more impressive than his brute force approach. Sarah's second-round opponent was Tom Bradley, a construction worker in his 30s who had won the competition 2 years running. Tom approached the match with professional respect, recognizing that Sarah's first victory hadn't been a fluke. "I've heard good things about your grip strength," Tom said as they settled into position. "This should be a real contest." Tom's approach was more sophisticated than Jake's had been. Instead of trying to overpower Sarah immediately, he focused on establishing a solid position and then gradually applying pressure. He had the experience to recognize that technique would be more important than raw force against an opponent like Sarah. The match lasted longer than Sarah's first, with both competitors settling in for a sustained battle of strength and endurance. Tom's professional experience with heavy manual labor gave him formidable grip strength and wrist stability, making him a much more challenging opponent than Jake had been. For several minutes, neither competitor could gain a significant advantage. The crowd watched in fascination as the two arms remained locked in the center position, both Sarah and Tom straining with effort, but neither able to move the other's hand more than a few inches. Sarah could feel the burn in her arm muscles as the match continued, but she also sensed that Tom was tiring more quickly than she was. Her years of sustained physical work had given her excellent muscular endurance, and she had learned to pace herself during extended efforts. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Sarah began to gain ground. Tom fought back valiantly, but he couldn't match the combination of technique and conditioning that Sarah brought to the contest. When his hand finally touched the table, both competitors were exhausted but respectful of each other's efforts. "Hell of a match," Tom said, genuinely impressed. "You've got some serious skills, young lady." Sarah's semifinal opponent was Marcus himself, who had advanced through his bracket with increasingly confident victories. As they approached each other at the center table, the crowd noise reached a crescendo. This was the match everyone had been waiting for, the rematch between the small girl and the football star who had challenged her. Marcus looked different than he had at the beginning of the competition. His earlier cockiness had been replaced by a more focused, serious demeanor. He had clearly been watching Sarah's matches and understood that she was a legitimate threat rather than an easy target. "So here we are again," Marcus said as they settled into position across from each other. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Here we are." The referee checked their positioning and grip, making sure both competitors were ready for what everyone expected to be the most competitive match of the day. The crowd fell silent in anticipation. "This is it," Sarah's grandfather said quietly from beside the platform. "Show them what real strength looks like." As the referee prepared to start the match, Sarah felt the same calm focus that came over her when she was working on a particularly challenging mechanical problem. This wasn't about Marcus or his bullying behavior. This was about demonstrating that dedication and skill could overcome size and reputation. The final confrontation was about to begin. The silence around the platform was complete as Sarah and Marcus locked hands for their semifinal match. Every person in the crowd understood they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted how the story would end when it had begun months earlier in a high school cafeteria. Marcus had used the time between matches to study Sarah's technique, and he approached this contest with a strategy rather than just brute force. He had seen how she absorbed initial attacks and then used superior grip strength and endurance to gradually overcome her opponents. This time he planned to pace himself and try to match her technical approach rather than relying solely on his size advantage. "Ready?" the referee asked, his hand positioned to start the match. Both competitors nodded, their eyes locked on each other's faces. Sarah could see the determination in Marcus's expression, but also something else. A hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there during their cafeteria encounter. He was no longer completely confident in his ability to overpower her. "Go!" Marcus had learned from watching Sarah's previous matches, and instead of attempting an immediate power slam, he focused on establishing a solid position and maintaining steady pressure. For the first minute of the match, neither competitor gained significant ground, both testing the other's strength and looking for weaknesses. The crowd watched in fascination as the contest developed into a true battle of technique and conditioning. Marcus's football training had given him excellent upper body strength, but Sarah's years of practical mechanical work had developed her grip and wrist stability in ways that pure athletic training couldn't match. Slowly, Sarah began to employ the same patient strategy that had served her well in previous matches. Instead of rushing or trying to force quick progress, she maintained steady pressure while waiting for Marcus to make a mistake or begin to tire. Her breathing remained controlled and even, while Marcus was already showing signs of strain. 3 minutes into the match, Sarah sensed her opportunity. Marcus's grip was beginning to loosen slightly, and his arm position was becoming less stable. She increased her pressure incrementally, not enough to alert him to her strategy, but sufficient to begin gaining ground. Marcus felt the shift and responded by putting more force into his own effort, but this only accelerated his fatigue. Sarah's superior conditioning and technique were beginning to tell, and she could feel his resistance weakening with each passing second. "Come on, Marcus," one of his friends shouted from the crowd, but the encouragement couldn't provide the strength that Marcus's muscles were beginning to lack. Sarah's victory in the semifinal was decisive but not quick. She took nearly 5 minutes to gradually work Marcus's hand down to the table, demonstrating the same patient, methodical approach that had characterized all of her matches. When the referee finally declared her the winner, Marcus sat back in his chair, breathing heavily and staring at his defeated hand. "Good match," Sarah said, extending her hand for the traditional post-match handshake. Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their afternoons at shopping malls or scrolling through social media, she could be found in her grandfather's old garage, working on car engines or helping him repair broken furniture. Her hands, though small and delicate in appearance, had developed an unusual strength from years of gripping wrenches, lifting heavy parts, and learning trades that most people considered too demanding for someone of her size. At 17, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with auburn hair that she usually kept tied back in a simple ponytail. Her green eyes held a quiet determination that most people missed at first glance. She wore simple clothes, faded jeans and practical t-shirts, nothing that would draw attention to herself. Sarah preferred it that way. She had learned early in life that being underestimated often worked to her advantage. The small town of Millbrook had its social hierarchies, like most places. At the top sat kids like Marcus Thompson, the star quarterback of the high school football team. Marcus was everything Sarah was not: tall, popular, and confident to the point of arrogance. He stood 6 feet 2, with broad shoulders and the kind of easy smile that made teachers overlook his mediocre grades and gave him a free pass with most of his behavior. Marcus had a habit of making others feel small. He would walk through the school hallways like he owned them, surrounded by his group of loyal followers who laughed at his jokes and agreed with everything he said. His favorite targets were the quiet kids, the ones who wouldn't fight back or cause a scene. Sarah had watched him humiliate others countless times, always finding some way to make them feel worthless while making himself look bigger. The cafeteria incident happened on a Tuesday in late October. Tom's professional experience made him her most challenging opponent yet, and Sarah knew she would need every advantage of technique and conditioning to have a chance. For the first several minutes, the match appeared completely even. Both competitors maintained perfect form, neither gaining more than a few inches of advantage before the other recovered. The crowd watched in near silence, fascinated by the technical battle playing out before them. Sarah could feel the burn in her arm and shoulder muscles, but her breathing remained controlled and her focus absolute. This was similar to the mental state she entered when working on particularly complex mechanical problems, where sustained concentration and patience were more important than quick solutions. Tom was fighting valiantly, but as the match extended beyond 10 minutes, Sarah's superior conditioning began to make a difference. Her years of sustained physical work had developed not just strength but remarkable muscular endurance, and she could sense that Tom was beginning to tire more quickly than she was. The turning point came nearly 12 minutes into the match, when Tom's grip loosened just slightly during what should have been a strong push. Sarah immediately recognized the opportunity and began applying steady, relentless pressure that Tom couldn't quite match. Inch by inch, Sarah worked Tom's hand toward the table. The crowd's murmur grew louder as they realized what they were witnessing. A teenage girl was about to win an arm wrestling competition against opponents who were bigger, older, and more experienced than she was. When Tom's hand finally touched the table, the crowd erupted in applause that could be heard throughout the festival grounds. Sarah had won the championship through the same patient technical approach that had characterized all of her matches. Tom stood immediately and offered his hand, his expression showing genuine respect and admiration. "That was incredible," he said. "I've never seen technique like that, especially from someone your age. You earned every bit of that victory." The tournament organizer approached with a trophy and a small cash prize, both of which seemed almost insignificant compared to what Sarah had actually accomplished. She had demonstrated that years of hard work and dedication could overcome natural physical advantages, and that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured just by looking at someone. Marcus had remained to watch the final, and as Sarah stepped down from the platform with her trophy, he approached her one more time. His expression was completely different from any she had seen before, showing genuine respect rather than mockery or false friendliness. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said, his voice quiet enough that only Sarah could hear. "I spent a lot of time thinking people were worth less than me because they were different, or smaller, or quieter. You taught me that I was wrong about a lot of things." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of sarcasm or insincerity, but found none. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "That means more than winning the competition." Marcus nodded and walked away, leaving Sarah to celebrate with her grandfather and the small group of supporters who had gathered around her. The day had transformed from a simple festival appearance into something much more significant. As they packed up their booth later that evening, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened since that first encounter in the cafeteria. She had never set out to prove anything to Marcus or anyone else, but circumstances had forced her to demonstrate that appearances could be deceiving, and that real strength came from dedication rather than genetics. "Your grandmother would have been proud," her grandfather said as they loaded the Mustang onto their trailer. "She always said that the strongest people were the ones who didn't need to prove it to anyone." Sarah smiled, thinking about the grandmother she barely remembered, but whose influence had shaped much of her grandfather's philosophy about work and character. The day had been about more than just winning a competition. It had been about standing up to bullying and demonstrating that respect had to be earned rather than demanded. The following Monday at school, Sarah noticed immediate changes in how people treated her. Students who had never acknowledged her existence now nodded respectfully when they passed her in the hallways. Teachers who had overlooked her in class discussions now called on her more frequently and listened more carefully to her responses. Marcus, true to his word, had changed his behavior as well. He no longer targeted other students for humiliation, and he had even been seen helping some of the younger kids with their homework. His friends, sensing the shift in his attitude, had gradually adjusted their own behavior to match. Sarah's victory had rippled outward through the school and community in ways she hadn't anticipated. Other students, particularly girls, began approaching her for advice about standing up to bullies or pursuing interests that others told them were inappropriate for their gender. Sarah found herself becoming an accidental role model, a position she hadn't sought but gradually learned to embrace. The local newspaper ran a story about Sarah's championship victory, focusing not just on the surprising outcome, but on the broader message about determination and hard work overcoming natural advantages. The article included quotes from several of her defeated opponents, all of whom spoke respectfully about her technique and sportsmanship. The story attracted attention beyond Millbrook, with Sarah receiving letters from other young people facing similar challenges. Some were girls who wanted to pursue traditionally male careers or hobbies, while others were boys who had been bullied because of their size or interests. Sarah answered every letter personally, sharing the lessons her grandfather had taught her about the value of persistence and the importance of not being defined by other people's expectations. 6 months later, Sarah's life had settled into a new normal. She continued working with her grandfather on car restorations, but now their business had more customers than they could handle. Word of Sarah's skills had spread throughout the region, attracting car enthusiasts who wanted to work with the young woman who had gained such an unusual reputation. Marcus had kept his word about changing his behavior, and he had even approached Sarah about helping him with some mechanical problems he was having with his own car. Their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to respectfully professional, with Marcus showing genuine interest in learning some of the skills that Sarah had mastered. The arm wrestling trophy sat on a shelf in Sarah's grandfather's garage, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented her real passion. She rarely looked at it anymore, having moved on to new projects and challenges that interested her more than reflecting on past victories. But the lesson she had learned from her encounters with Marcus remained central to how she approached every aspect of her life. She had discovered that standing up to bullies was important not just for her own self-respect, but for creating an environment where others felt safe to be themselves and pursue their interests without fear. Sarah had also learned that strength came in many forms, and that the most important battles were often won through patience, technique, and determination, rather than raw power. The hands that Marcus had mocked as weak had proven to be stronger than he could have imagined, not because of their physical power alone, but because of the years of dedication and hard work that had shaped them. The small town of Millbrook had learned something important as well, that respect couldn't be demanded or inherited, but had to be earned through character and action. Sarah Mitchell had earned that respect not by seeking it, but by staying true to herself and demonstrating that real strength was measured by what someone could build rather than what they could tear down. In the end, Marcus's mocking words about Sarah's weak hands had become the catalyst for a transformation that affected not just the two of them, but their entire community. Sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and strength revealed itself in the most unlikely places. Sarah was sitting alone at her usual table near the windows, reading a book about mechanical engineering while eating her lunch. She preferred the solitude, using the time to study or simply think without the constant chatter that filled most of the other tables. The autumn light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Marcus had been having what he considered a bad day. The football team had lost their previous game, and his girlfriend had broken up with him that morning. He was looking for someone to take his frustrations out on, someone who wouldn't fight back and make him look bad in front of his friends. His eyes scanned the cafeteria until they landed on Sarah, sitting quietly by herself. "Look at little Sarah," Marcus announced loudly, making sure his voice carried across the nearby tables. "Always sitting alone with her books. What are you reading about now? How to fix cars like some kind of mechanic." Sarah looked up from her book, meeting his gaze calmly. She had dealt with bullies before, though none quite as persistent as Marcus. "Just studying," she replied simply, hoping he would lose interest and move on to someone else. But Marcus was just getting started. He walked over to her table, his friends trailing behind him like a pack of wolves following their leader. "You know what I heard? I heard you help your grandfather fix cars and stuff. That's pretty weird for a girl, don't you think?" "There's nothing weird about learning useful skills," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. She closed her book and placed it carefully in her backpack, preparing to leave if the situation escalated further. Marcus laughed, a sound that held no warmth or genuine humor. "Useful skills? Come on, Sarah. You're like what, 100 pounds soaking wet? I bet you can barely lift a wrench, let alone actually fix anything important." The cafeteria had grown quieter, with other students turning to watch the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, but none moved to intervene. This was how it always went with Marcus. People were too afraid of becoming his next target to stand up for anyone else. "I do just fine," Sarah said, standing up from her chair. She was significantly shorter than Marcus, having to look up to meet his eyes, but she didn't back down or show any signs of intimidation. "Oh, you do just fine?" Marcus mocked, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Prove it then. I bet those tiny little hands of yours couldn't even grip something properly. You probably drop tools all the time." Without waiting for her response, Marcus reached out and grabbed Sarah's right hand, holding it up for everyone to see. His hand was much larger than hers, completely engulfing her fingers and palm. "Look at this, everyone. These are supposed to be the hands of someone who fixes cars? They're like a child's hands, probably weak as paper." Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever someone underestimated her based on her appearance. She had spent years proving herself to skeptical customers at her grandfather's repair shop, demonstrating that size didn't determine capability or strength. But this was different. This was public humiliation, designed to make her feel powerless and small. "Let go of my hand," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that Marcus completely missed. Instead of releasing her, Marcus tightened his grip, squeezing her hand as hard as he could. "What's wrong, Sarah? Can't handle a little pressure? I told you those hands were weak. You probably can't even open a jar of pickles without help." The pain in Sarah's hand was significant, but she had experienced worse during her years of physical work. More importantly, she could feel something that Marcus couldn't. The true strength in her grip, strength that had been developed through years of hard work and practical application. Her grandfather had always told her that real strength came from use, not from size or appearance. I said let go, Sarah repeated, her voice still calm but with an edge that made a few nearby students take notice. Marcus was enjoying himself too much to pay attention to the warning in her tone. He squeezed harder, expecting to see tears or hear her beg him to stop. Come on, admit it. Admit that you're too weak to do any of the things you pretend to do. Tell everyone that girls like you should stick to girl things instead of playing pretend with tools and engines. That was the moment Sarah decided she had heard enough. Without changing her expression or giving any warning of what was about to happen, she began to squeeze back. The change in Marcus's expression was immediate and dramatic. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by surprise and then growing discomfort. Sarah's grip, which had seemed so small and weak in his large hand, was now applying pressure that he hadn't expected. Her fingers, strengthened by years of gripping tools and lifting heavy objects, pressed into his hand with surprising force. "What the?" Marcus started to say, but the words caught in his throat as Sarah continued to increase the pressure. Sarah's grip strength had been developed through years of practical work that most teenagers never experienced. She had spent countless hours holding on to wrenches while applying torque to stubborn bolts, gripping heavy engine parts while maneuvering them into position, and maintaining her hold on tools even when her hands were slippery with oil or grease. Her grandfather had taught her that a proper grip was essential for both safety and effectiveness in mechanical work. The pain in Marcus's hand was becoming difficult to ignore, but his pride prevented him from immediately backing down. He tried to squeeze back harder, attempting to reassert his dominance, but found that Sarah's grip only seemed to get stronger in response. Her small hand, which he had dismissed as weak and useless, was now causing him genuine discomfort. "Let go," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. The demand sounded more like a request, and several students nearby noticed the change in his tone. Sarah looked directly into his eyes, her expression calm and controlled. "I asked you to let go first," she replied simply. "You chose not to listen." The standoff continued for several more seconds, with Marcus's discomfort becoming increasingly obvious to the watching students. His face was beginning to show strain, and he was having trouble maintaining his grip on Sarah's hand as the pain intensified. What had started as his attempt to humiliate her was rapidly turning into his own public embarrassment. Finally, Marcus's pride cracked under the combination of physical discomfort and social pressure. Okay, he said, trying to make his surrender sound casual rather than desperate. "Let go now." But Sarah wasn't quite finished making her point. Instead of immediately releasing him, she maintained her grip for a few more seconds, demonstrating that the situation was now entirely under her control. When she finally did let go, it was clearly her choice rather than his demand. Marcus stepped back, shaking his hand and trying to hide the fact that it was hurting. He looked around at the watching students, many of whom were now looking at him with expressions ranging from surprise to amusement. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went for him. "Whatever," Marcus said, attempting to salvage some dignity from the situation. "That was just whatever. Come on, guys, let's get out of here." As Marcus and his friends walked away, Sarah could hear whispered conversations starting up around the cafeteria. The story would spread quickly through the school, she knew. By the end of the day, everyone would have heard about how the small, quiet girl had made the big football star back down in the middle of the cafeteria. Sarah gathered her belongings and left the cafeteria herself, not interested in becoming the center of attention or answering questions about what had just happened. She preferred to let her actions speak for themselves, the way her grandfather had taught her. Words could be ignored or dismissed, but demonstrations of capability were much harder to argue with. That afternoon, Sarah walked home to her grandfather's house, where she lived since her parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The old man was in his garage as usual, working on a customer's truck that had been giving him trouble all week. He looked up when she entered, immediately noticing something different in her demeanor. "How was school today, Sarah?" he asked, wiping his hands on an old rag. Sarah considered how to answer. Her grandfather had always encouraged her to stand up for herself, but he also valued humility and avoiding unnecessary conflict. "Someone learned not to judge people by their appearance," she said simply. The old man nodded, understanding more from her tone than from her words. "Good," he said. "Sometimes people need to learn that lesson. Just remember, strength isn't about proving you're better than others. It's about being able to protect what matters and help when you're needed. Sarah picked up a wrench and joined him at the workbench, ready to help with the repairs. The incident at school was already behind her, but she suspected it wouldn't be the last time she would need to demonstrate that appearances could be deceiving. The news of what had happened in the cafeteria spread through the school exactly as Sarah had predicted. By the next morning, the story had grown in the telling, with some versions claiming that Sarah had actually hurt Marcus badly enough that he needed medical attention. Others said that she had challenged him to an arm wrestling match and won easily. The truth was simpler but no less significant. A small girl had stood up to the school's biggest bully and made him back down. Marcus himself was dealing with the aftermath of his public embarrassment in his own way. He spent the rest of the week avoiding Sarah entirely, taking different routes through the school hallways and eating his lunch at a table on the opposite side of the cafeteria. His friends, sensing weakness, began to distance themselves slightly, no longer hanging on his every word the way they had before. For Sarah, life continued much as it had before, with one important difference. Other students now looked at her with a new kind of respect. The quiet girl who read engineering books and helped fix cars had proven that she was not someone to be underestimated or pushed around. But more importantly to Sarah, she had proven to herself that the strength and skills her grandfather had taught her were valuable in more ways than she had realized. The first part of Sarah's story had established something important: that strength came in many forms, and that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared least threatening. But this was just the beginning of a larger lesson that would unfold over the coming weeks, as the consequences of that single moment in the cafeteria continued to ripple outward through the small town of Millbrook. The weeks following the cafeteria incident brought unexpected changes to Sarah's quiet life. Students who had never spoken to her before began nodding when they passed her in the hallways. Some even approached her with questions about cars or mechanical problems they were having at home. Sarah found herself becoming an unlikely source of practical advice for her classmates, though she remained as reserved as ever. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling with his damaged reputation. The story of his encounter with Sarah had spread beyond the school, reaching parents and eventually some of the adults in town. His father, a successful businessman who prided himself on his son's athletic achievements and social status, was not pleased to hear that Marcus had been publicly embarrassed by someone half his size. "You need to fix this situation," his father told him one evening over dinner. "The Thompsons don't get shown up by anyone, especially not by some girl who works on cars with her grandfather. People are starting to talk, and it's reflecting poorly on our family." The pressure from his father, combined with the loss of respect from his peers, drove Marcus to make a decision that would prove to be his biggest mistake yet. He decided that he needed to redeem himself by challenging Sarah to something more public and definitive than their brief hand-squeezing contest in the cafeteria. The opportunity came during the annual Millbrook Harvest Festival, a town-wide celebration that drew people from surrounding communities. The festival featured various competitions and demonstrations, including tests of strength and skill that were popular with both participants and spectators. Marcus saw this as the perfect venue to restore his reputation and put Sarah back in what he considered her proper place. Sarah had been looking forward to the festival for weeks, but not for the competitions. Her grandfather had arranged for them to display some of their restoration work at a booth dedicated to local craftspeople and businesses. They had spent months rebuilding a classic 1967 Mustang, and this would be their first opportunity to show it off to the community. The car was Sarah's pride and joy. She had done most of the engine work herself, learning advanced techniques that even some professional mechanics found challenging. The project had taken nearly a year to complete, with Sarah spending every free moment in the garage, covered in grease and completely absorbed in the intricate work of bringing the old machine back to life. On the morning of the festival, Sarah and her grandfather arrived early to set up their display. The Mustang gleamed in the morning sunlight, its restored blue paint job reflecting the clouds overhead. Sarah had polished every chrome detail until it shone like silver, and the engine bay was so clean it looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. "You should be proud of this work, Sarah," her grandfather said as they arranged informational posters around their booth. "This is professional quality restoration. You've got skills that most people twice your age would envy." Sarah smiled, running her hand along the car's smooth fender. This was where she felt most confident and capable, surrounded by the tangible results of her hard work and dedication. The mechanical world made sense to her in a way that social situations often didn't. Here, results spoke louder than appearances or popularity. The festival grounds gradually filled with people as the morning progressed. Families wandered between booths selling local crafts and foods, while groups of teenagers gravitated toward the games and competitions. Sarah noticed several of her classmates admiring the Mustang, some asking detailed questions about the restoration process that she was happy to answer. It was just after noon when Marcus appeared at their booth, accompanied by his usual group of followers. Sarah noticed them approaching and felt a familiar tension in her stomach, but she continued politely answering questions from a middle-aged man who was interested in having some work done on his own classic car. "Nice car," Marcus said loudly, interrupting the conversation. "Did your grandfather do all the real work, or did you actually help with something important?" The man Sarah had been talking to looked uncomfortable and quickly excused himself, not wanting to be caught in what was obviously about to become a confrontation. Sarah's grandfather, who had been arranging tools at the back of their booth, looked up with a stern expression. "Marcus," Sarah said evenly, not rising to the bait, "what do you want?" Marcus smiled, but it was the same cold, calculating expression he had worn in the cafeteria weeks earlier. "I'd been thinking about our little encounter at school. You got lucky that day, catching me off guard. But I think we both know that if we had a real test of strength, things would go differently." "I'm not interested in whatever you're planning," Sarah replied, turning back to organizing some brochures on their table. "Why don't you go enjoy the festival with your friends?" But Marcus wasn't about to be dismissed so easily. He had spent weeks planning this moment, and he wasn't going to let it pass without achieving his goal of publicly redeeming himself. "There's an arm wrestling competition starting in an hour," he announced, "open to anyone who wants to enter. I'm signed up, and I think you should be too." The suggestion drew interested looks from the people browsing nearby booths. Sarah could feel the attention focusing on their conversation, exactly what Marcus had intended. He was trying to back her into a corner, making it difficult for her to refuse without appearing afraid. "Arm wrestling?" Sarah's grandfather spoke up, moving to stand beside his granddaughter. "That seems like an odd way to spend a festival day, young man." Marcus turned his attention to the older man, sensing an opportunity to apply more pressure. "Just a friendly competition, sir. Nothing serious. Unless Sarah thinks she might not do as well in a real contest as she did grabbing onto my hand in the cafeteria." The challenge was clear, and Sarah understood that Marcus had deliberately chosen a public venue to make his move. If she refused, the story would spread that she had backed down when given a chance to prove herself properly. If she accepted, she would be entering a competition designed to favor people with Marcus's size and build. Sarah looked at her grandfather, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. He had taught her many things over the years, including the importance of standing up to bullies and not backing down from justified challenges. But he had also taught her to be smart about how and when she fought her battles. "All right," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the area around their booth. "I'll enter the competition." Marcus's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded Sarah of a predator who had just spotted easy prey. "Excellent. This should be interesting." Word of the impending match between Sarah and Marcus spread quickly through the festival grounds. By the time the arm wrestling competition was scheduled to begin, a substantial crowd had gathered around the designated area. The competition was being held on a raised platform, making it easy for spectators to see the action. Sarah arrived at the platform with her grandfather, who carried a small cooler containing ice water and towels. He had insisted on acting as her corner support, treating the event with the same seriousness he brought to any important task. "Remember," he told her quietly as they approached the registration table, "this isn't about proving anything to him or anyone else." Marcus looked at her offered hand, then up at her face, seeing something there that he had completely missed during their earlier encounters. This wasn't just about physical strength or mechanical skill. Sarah possessed a quiet confidence and determination that came from years of proving herself in situations where failure meant more than just embarrassment. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly, taking her hand. "Good match." The crowd's reaction to Sarah's victory was electric. Here was a 17-year-old girl who stood barely over 5 feet tall, defeating much larger opponents through superior technique and conditioning. But for Sarah, the real satisfaction wasn't in beating Marcus specifically, but in demonstrating that her years of hard work and dedication had value beyond just fixing cars. Sarah's final opponent was Tom Bradley, who had won his own semi-final match against another construction worker. Tom approached their championship match with professional respect and genuine curiosity about how his experience would match up against Sarah's unique combination of skills. "I've got to admit," Tom said as they prepared for the final, "I never expected to be facing someone like you in a championship match. This should be really interesting." The crowd for the final was the largest of the day, with word having spread throughout the festival about the unusual young competitor who had made it to the championship round. Sarah's grandfather stood at the edge of the platform, his expression showing quiet pride rather than nervousness. "Win or lose," he told Sarah during the brief break before the final, "you've already proven everything that needed proving. Just go out there and show them the best of what you can do." The championship match began much like Sarah's contest with Marcus, with both competitors settling in for a sustained battle rather than looking for quick victory.